Well, depending on where you are joining from, good afternoon or good morning. And if we have anybody overseas, a good evening to you. Welcome to the Mobilize You Wellness Series webinar for March the 22nd. My name is Michael Johnny. I'm along with Krista Jensen. We're proud to be your hosts today, representing Innovation New York's Knowledge Mobilization Unit. At this time, I would normally read off a land acknowledgement, but I'm trying to do that a little bit different. I don't want to make it such a sort of a normal sort of part of agenda. I've realized over the last year how important the land is to me. It has been an important part of my wellness. It is certainly a critical part of my efforts around reconciliation as a settler. And while the York University lands are located on Anishinaabe Nation, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, and Métis territories, I too am located in traditional territories overseen by the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation, which is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, something I need to learn a little bit about. And I'm excited to do so because, as I mentioned, my relationship with the land has been really important over the last year. I certainly invite you to learn a little bit more about the traditional lands that you are on as well. We are privileged today. It is always a pleasure to welcome a friend of our office and leading researcher at York University, Professor Gordon Flett, who is a Canadian Research Chair in Personality and Health. He'll be walking us through a presentation focusing on mattering today. A few housekeeping items. Please hold questions to the end. Because it's a webinar, it ups some security for us. I will read the questions if you wanted to post them in the chat or in the Q&A function. We'll get to as many as we can. We are going to end promptly at 1 o'clock Eastern time with respect to everybody's time. Thank you once again for joining us, and I'll pass things over to Gord.
Thanks very much, Michael. Let's see, we got the screen share there. We good to go? Is my screen sharing there?
All good, yes.
Okay, yep. Fine, thanks. Well, I just wanted to briefly acknowledge the support that our work has received. And I say our because there's a long list of collaborators here that I have no time to mention because of time constraints, but I want to acknowledge the CRC program, York's Faculty of Health, and SSHRC, and there's other funders as well. I'm very glad to have this opportunity, and I consider the KM office to be friends too. One of the best places to visit in the campus, and give this opportunity to me is something I appreciate. And today I'm going to talk about mattering in terms of trying to enhance understanding of it, then describe some research that link it with some key outcomes, and also point to some alarming data suggesting that there's too many young people who lack a feeling of mattering. And also, of course, try to describe some ways of promoting mattering. And the other flip side of this, you want to stop anything that leads somebody to think that they don't matter. So why do I focus on mattering? Some of it's fortuitous. I got a book back in 1985 as a graduate student that had this excerpt by the fellow who originated the concept, so that piqued my interest. But I found that this is a construct that has enormous resonance with other people across the board. People say, what's mattering? Then you tell them and you can see their eyes light up typically, usually because they're remembering somebody who really gave them that sense of mattering. It's really the key to understanding many people. I can point to many clinical case studies of people who, when it comes down to it, their main vulnerability is they feel they don't matter to other people. It's a key source of resilience and adaptability, and I will show some data that illustrate that. It's a powerful, unique predictor when it's pitted against other factors that predict outcomes, and I'll talk a little more about that. And most importantly, there's an enormous knowledge transfer exchange potential here in terms of putting mattering into action. The main creator of this is a fellow named Morris Rosenberg, Manny to his friends, who introduced the mattering construct in 1981. I have scoured the internet and looked everywhere, and that's the only picture that I can find of him. And as I get older and seem to have the same hairline, I appreciate having the blurry image, especially for Zoom chats. So hats off literally to Morris Manny Rosenberg, who had an incredible insight into what made people tick, and especially younger people. He is known mostly for his work on self-esteem and the famous Rosenberg self-esteem scale, but also said a little bit about mattering starting in 1981 before, unfortunately, he passed away too soon in 1991 before he could circle back and really flesh out the construct. So that's the paper, Rosenberg and McCullough, 1981. Basically, we're talking about the feeling of being important and significant to others. He said the person low on mattering feels irrelevant, unimportant, or peripheral in the minds of others. And he said that usually you try to satisfy this need for mattering in positive ways, but it's also possible, especially for younger people, to turn to antisocial acts to satisfy this need to matter. And there was just a paper that was published recently in Britain that talks about how a sort of misguided sense of needing to matter can translate into violence and acting out tendencies. Also, they said that mattering is particularly relevant to adolescents and to older people who may feel that they're wondering in terms of their identity, whether they matter to other people as much as they hope to matter. But it's something that's universal, and it's a basic need and feeling that applies to everyone, but especially adolescents and older adults. And ideally, we see mattering as reciprocal. And this is reflected by a researcher and theorist named Isaac Prelotensky, who talks about not only being someone who has value to other people, but giving value to other people in terms of what you can do to generate positive experiences. So there's an agentic side to this, because you don't have to necessarily wait for somebody to treat you the right way. You can act in ways that generate those positive experiences. So if you feel like you matter, you feel like you are someone who is seen and heard, somebody who's believed in and valued by others, cared for and cared about, and you have the general sense that you would be missed if you weren't around anymore. And who doesn't want to have those things in their life? That just shows you how the potential feeling can be so salient and intense for people when they feel seen and heard, believed in, cared about, and know that they would be missed. Here's one of the components, attention. You command the interest of another person. You're feeling noticed and heard versus not noticed. And you can see the Charlie Brown cartoon down there, Lucy. So what do you think? What difference does it make? You never listen anyway, says Charlie. Well, I was just making conversation. Well, when you make conversation, you have to listen too. Oh, you do? And this emphasizes the reciprocal two-way nature and how people need to feel that somebody is actually paying attention to them. The importance factor is another facet that Rosenberg and McCullough talked about. Someone notices you and cares about you so that you feel valued, cherished, wanted, versus the flip side, insignificant and as if no one cares. And of course, we all like to feel important to a realistic degree. Another component that was identified was the sense of dependence, the idea that someone needs you and relies on you, someone depends on you. So you have a role, a niche, that you matter to other people because you can make their lives better. And this came out of work on caregivers who were interviewed, and they said that they felt like they mattered when their role was recognized by others, and then on top of that, appreciated by others, that you're someone people feel grateful for and they appreciate you in their lives. And it's not just that they appreciate what you do, but they appreciate who you are at a personal level, your being, your essence, yourself. They appreciate you as an individual. And that this can be unconditional. It's not, if you do the right thing, if you're perfect, but in fact, they just appreciate you as an individual. A key thing that I get from reviewers a lot is, well, isn't mattering overlapping with a lot of other constructs, and does it add anything to the party? And it's key to emphasize that mattering is simply not meaning or purpose in life. There certainly is overlap with these ideas, but mattering is more interpersonal in its focus. It's not just a sense of belongingness. Here I would draw attention to those people who might feel that they're a part of a group, but within the group, they don't feel visible, they don't feel heard. So they could feel like they belong, but in fact, they don't really have that much significance. So there is an important distinction. Those two variables tend to be correlated about 0.5, but each predict different things when pitted against each other. And it most certainly should not be equated with self-esteem. And this was addressed in Rosenberg and McCullough's original paper. They described the results of 4 studies that show that once you control for self-esteem in very large samples of adolescents, controlling for self-esteem still leaves a clear link between higher feelings of mattering and less depression in these large samples of adolescents. And indeed, there's probably about 10 other studies like that have followed that show that mattering and self-esteem, of course, are related, but they're not the same thing. And somebody can feel capable and liked, but if they don't feel that they are important to other people, they're not likely going to be very, very happy individuals. The main measure of mattering is called the general mattering scale, and it's 5 basic items like this. You just rate yourself from 1 to 4. How important are you to others? How much do other people pay attention to you? How much would you be missed if you went away? How interested are others in what you have to say, and how much do other people depend on you? And you just get a score that can go as high as 20. Most people come in around a 15, so that there is a skew towards some feeling of mattering. But once people start to have lower scores on this, it predicts a variety of negative outcomes. I just wanted to point out before I get into some of the other issues is that mattering is looked at with that scale as a general phenomenon, but there's other measures that look at it as a domain-specific variable. So you can talk about mattering at home in terms of mattering in your family, and there's measures that tap mattering to mother, mattering to father, mattering to friends, mattering at work, and there's some new scales that are in existence to assess that. And also mattering outside of your home and the work context in terms of mattering in your community. So we're talking about a very, very broad variable here that can be assessed generally in terms of general mattering, but also in some very specific context. There was even one study that looked at mattering in terms of how much you matter to someone who is a mentor, and the items were just modified to tap that specific relationship. Now, one of the reasons why I find this such an inspiring variable, and it's something that is very relatable to people, is the amazing stories of resilience that you get when you see somebody who's had great adversity and somebody comes into their lives and transforms it in a positive way. And a quote about this from one of the world's most famous resilience researchers, Emmy Werner, reflects this. She said from their longitudinal study in Hawaii that the most optimistic thing we had seen in our study is that even under, oh, okay, I'm getting messages from the home office here. That my slide is not full screen, but I don't know what I can do to fix that without screwing us up. Okay. Sorry for the interruption here, just a second. I can at least make it better. Hopefully that makes it better. Anyway, Emmy Werner said, the most optimistic thing we have seen in our study is that even under adverse circumstances, change is possible if the older child or adolescent encounters new experiences with people who give meaning to his life and who tell him that he matters. And the he refers to the fact that it was mostly adolescent boys that they were focusing on. So she's saying the key to the resilience is this tendency to have people who tell them that their life matters. Here's a fictional example of this. One caring adult, Arthur Boo Radley, if you know the story To Kill a Mockingbird, Arthur steps in, spoiler alert, and saves the children at the end from the attack that's coming their way. And it's a powerful ending to that movie, in part because of that interaction and the saving by that one person who had been derided in terms of all these beliefs, but it turns out to be the caring adult who saves the children. Here's another example of a real person, Oprah, who's talked about her 4th grade teacher who was someone who saved her life. She was the person who made her feel like she mattered because Oprah had been abused and mistreated up until she encountered Mrs. Duncan. And in her penultimate show, Oprah talked again about Mrs. Duncan and brought her out to thank her once again. And you can argue that maybe the whole Oprah empire is due to this. In terms of this, here's a quote from Oprah. The yearning to feel heard, needed, and important is so strong in all of us that we seek that validation in whatever form we can get it. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a picture of the recent interview that Oprah had with Meghan Markle, where, there's Oprah showing the importance of being seen and heard, but also then we learned the critical information about the idea of feeling suicidal and being denied the help, which is the epitome of not mattering in terms of how that would feel. Here's another example, the book in the movie The Blind Side. Michael Orr, who went on to become a well-known NFL player, who was taken in by the Toohey family. Another amazing story. Moving in with the Tooheys was the thing that made it all come true, says Michael. They treated me like a member of the family. I wasn't just a special project to them. I was a kid who wanted to feel loved and supported, and to know that my dreams and my future were just as important as anyone else's, which really is at the essence of mattering. A family, in this case, taking him in and caring about him and showing him the attention that he needed to get him on track. And that track eventually becomes playing in the NFL and becoming a motivational and inspirational speaker. Now, the flip side of mattering is the obverse of mattering is the way that Rosenberg talked about it, feelings of not mattering. Essentially, obverse is best defined as a two-sided coin of, in this case, mattering versus not mattering. You can look at it symbolically as that coin comes up heads, you matter and you win in life. If it comes up tails, you feel like you don't matter, and that's likely going to set you on a path where you're more likely to lose in life, or at least not enjoy the benefits of a full and happy existence. So we call this concept, the flip side, antimattering, the feeling of not mattering to others who seem intent on making us feel insignificant, small perhaps even invisible. And these are not polar opposites, because there's different motivations that go along with being somebody exceedingly high in mattering versus being very low and feeling like you don't matter. Here's a fictional example of someone who felt like they didn't matter, from the famous Breakfast Club movie of 1985, Ali Sheedy, who played the character The Basket Case. If you recall the movie, these were 6 kids who had a detention on a Saturday at the school, in the high school. And when she was asked why she was there, it turned out that she just came because she had nowhere else to go, because her parents ignore her. And they said, when it's bad at home, what did your parents do to you? And her answer was, they ignore me. So she actually took a Saturday detention because at least there were people there and there was somebody to interact with, which wasn't the case at home. We've developed a measure called the antimattering scale, with items like how much do you feel like you don't matter? How often have you been treated in a way that makes you feel like you are insignificant? Another item is to what extent have you been made to feel like you are invisible? Again, 5 items. And this is a tribute in terms of the scale of the name to Paul Dirac, who was the famous scientist who introduced the concept of antimatter that won him the Nobel Prize for Physics and when he was 31 in 1933. And I put this in to highlight the fact that if you read this compelling book called The Strangest Man, The Hidden Life of Paul Dirac, well, it turns out Dirac had a father who treated him like he really didn't matter, or at least it was very conditional on being perfect in terms of performance. So he ended up having a very unhappy relationship with his father. His brother, who was treated the same way, sadly ended up taking his own life. And I just thought it's kind of ironic that a guy comes up with a concept of antimatter and in fact had been treated in ways that clearly fit what we would see as a route to feeling like you don't matter, in terms of the parental coldness that they both received. The notion of the flip side was really popularized by Nancy Schlossberg here, who's shown in that photo, who introduced it in 1989. She said the key to building community is to combat feeling marginalized and not mattering by building up a sense of mattering. And her particular focus was on adult learners at college and on retirees. She's written a separate book on the importance of mattering and other related concepts for people who are about to retire. And she was concerned about those adult learners who are coming back to university. I was formerly our undergraduate director, and I spent a lot of time with these students and could see how committed they were. but also how they needed to see that they were valued and made to feel welcome and belong, but also matter in terms of being seen as significant and recognizing what they were giving up. Here's a quote. She said, "The polar themes of marginality and mattering connect all of us, rich and poor, young and old, male and female. Are we part of things? Do we belong? Are we central or are we marginal? So do we make a difference? Do others care about us and make us feel like we matter?" Now, of course, and going back to Michael's introduction about talking about the importance of land, one of the most salient Canadian examples of the feeling of not mattering is what happened with our residential schools and the children here. And here I've put a photo of Phyllis Webstad, who's the originator of the Orange Shirt Days campaign. And you may not know that the orange shirt, and it says on her shirt, "Every child matters." The orange shirt is to symbolize that it was an orange shirt, a new orange shirt that she was wearing the day that the authorities came along and took her away unceremoniously without knowing it. And she says that symbolizes that feeling of not mattering and every child needing to feel like they matter. Now, just turn the page a little bit here and talk about a little bit of research that goes back to that theme about adapting and focus on the times that we're in terms of the adaptation to the pandemic. One of the things I felt about mattering is that it's a very, very relevant variable to just about any context that comes along. And a test that I thought would be a good one is, to what extent does it help us understand people's reactions to the pandemic? And indeed, we have evidence to indicate that it is central to a better experience during the pandemic if you feel like you matter, and a more negative experience if you feel like you don't matter. So I'll just talk briefly about new research that links mattering with greater self-reported adaptability, the ability to change and to accommodate to new circumstances. Less loneliness and depression is associated with higher feelings of mattering, and even more positive reactions to online learning and maybe even Zoom chats is related to the feeling of mattering. So just briefly, here's some results. Correlations with a sample of students from Israel, 462 university students. You can see across the way we have three measures, and the third measure is something I want to briefly talk about. We have mattering with the general mattering scale, the anti-mattering scale that I described, and I came up with the idea of adding a third scale as the pandemic started to tap the feeling that some people have, well, I matter now, but I'm afraid that I'm not going to matter going into the future, so there's an anxiety component to this. And if you look down the first column, you see that mattering is correlated with higher self-reported levels of adapting to the pandemic, and feelings of not mattering and a fear of not mattering are associated with lower reported adapting to the pandemic. And you can see in the far column that this extends to loneliness, that mattering is associated with less loneliness, anti-mattering and fear of not mattering are associated with greater loneliness. And in one paper, we talk about this as actually a double jeopardy situation. If people are feeling that they're insignificant and they're feeling totally isolated and alone, that's a pretty significant combination. And it's worrisome because we know that loneliness not only predicts long-term health problems, but also is associated with higher mortality. And the fear is that people who feel both lonely and insignificant are not going to engage in self-care to deal with the stress and the sense of isolation that they're contending with. Now, in terms of online experiences, we did a study with over 1,200 students from Israel, and it's many different aspects to it. I'll just focus on the mattering component. One of the things we asked them was to rate their online experience across a variety of different variables, and in there we mixed in mattering and the feeling of mattering while you're online and the feeling of not mattering while you're online. And you can see down the mattering column the benefits in terms of not only feeling less negative mood while online and more positive mood, but in terms of learning, feeling more attentive and focused, greater depth of learning, greater motivation. Another item was meeting my goals and expectations. All of them were wrapped around the concept of feeling like you matter when you're engaged with the online experience. And by the same token, flip side, feeling you don't matter, negative mood, less positive mood, and less engagement with various learning options along the way. So the moral of that story is relational factors are even more important probably when you're talking about a form of learning that seems more detached and less personal. There are still ways to try and address that. Now, one of the reasons to promote mattering is that it's a key to positive youth development as recognized by the National Research Council in the United States, and that communities, according to Eccles and Gutman, must try to find a way to provide resources and opportunities for young people to develop a sense of mattering, such as finding ways to have them volunteer or providing resources, providing there's some communities that dedicate resources to sports and play structures for younger people. And it goes beyond the very young children to focus on older adolescents who might feel that there's less concern with them now that they're more independent, but they still need these resources. But having said that this is a key to promoting positive youth development, there's a problem, and that is that there's an alarming number of young people who feel like they don't matter. Here's the results from a study that was done with an Ontario school board and their survey that's done every 2 years. 23,700 plus students, when asked to indicate their agreement with the item, I feel like I matter to other people, about 2/3 said, I agree or strongly agree, I matter to other people. But 1 in 5 students said they don't matter, point blank, that they didn't have any sense of feeling like they mattered. And another 1 in 7 aren't sure. So take that number and multiply by 1/3 and you'll see how many students felt like they weren't sure or they didn't know, they knew for sure that they felt like they didn't matter, which is far too many when you consider the things that the feeling of not mattering is related to. And then there's one item that's been used in a survey that's been administered to thousands of students across many jurisdictions. And it is the item, I feel like I matter in my community. And here's the results that were obtained from 3 different locations, including New Brunswick, Canada, with the 2009 survey. When asked to what extent do they feel like they agree with I matter in my community, 35% in Santa Clara said that they felt that, 47% in New Brunswick, and 41%. So fewer than half have a sense of feeling like they matter in their community. The story gets better when you turn to jurisdictions where they've put an emphasis on promoting mattering among young people. The 3 that come to mind the most are Alaska, Maine, and Vermont. And here's recent results from Maine and Vermont with these equally large samples. So you can see that mattering has gone up now, so that it's approaching 60% when we're talking about high school students. But my point there is that we're still saying that maybe 3 in 5 have a feeling like they matter in their community, and it's great that this is higher and due to the efforts in Maine and Vermont, but still 2 out of 5 feel like they don't matter, and that can be very problematic in a variety of ways for those young people. And how and why should we be concerned? Well, feelings of not mattering predict academic difficulties, physical health problems, and unfortunately, depression and suicidal tendencies as well. And just to illustrate this, I don't know if you can see this, but main thing in this diagram is to focus on the red component and just notice how it keeps going up. These are results that were from asking that one question in Alaska. So this is a chart that says, did you consider suicide in the past year? On the far left, you'll see that of the students who said that they feel like they matter in their community with that one item, 10.8% said that they had considered suicide. Those who weren't sure, the level of suicide ideation went up with 18.4%. And for those who said they don't matter, so they said, I don't matter in my community, 35% indicated that they had experienced suicide ideation in the past year. And this is the case. There's one result from Alaska that indicates, depending on how you do the stats, that you're 400% more likely to have had suicide ideation if you had a sense of not mattering in your community. And then once you don't matter in your community, then you can engage in behavior that's directed negatively towards the self or towards other people or both. Of course, not everybody does that. And there's a bunch of other factors that need to be considered. but it does increase a risk factor there. Some academic costs in terms of this, a greater risk of dropping out, shown by Lemon and Watson in 2011, lower levels of academic performance, shown in 2003, and lower academic self-efficacy, that feeling that I can do this, and lower school-related positive affect are all problematic here. So, you know, there's a clear message in terms of not just well-being, emotional well-being, but also motivation as reflected by the online learning results that I described earlier. So in terms of the key factor of knowledge mobilization, I like to use the phrase mobilizing mattering, putting it into action. A key point that prefaces all of this is that mattering is modifiable. It can be promoted. People can learn to treat others in ways that make them feel more like they matter. But also, as I said, there's an agentic component to this where people can engage with others in ways that can make them feel like they matter. And I'll talk about a few illustrations of that in a bit. In terms of the many different ways of applying this knowledge, one clear domain for applying it certainly is colleges and universities. I used to talk at length in my former days as associate dean about how a focus on mattering could lead to greater student retention, higher recruitment, more learning, and just more positively enhance the student experience in a variety of ways, and maybe also increase their connectedness beyond so that they become strong alumni of the university. There's many workplace applications as reflected by the Mattering at Work measures. There's a key element here to leadership training. If I wasn't a professor, I think maybe I could hit the circuit in terms of talking about becoming a coach for leadership training. And this has some very tangible illustrations associated with it. Here's a quote from my 2008 book, The Psychology of Mattering. The leader who demonstrates that the people he or she is leading actually matter to him or her is someone who will have dedicated people who are joining in on a shared mission. And some famous examples of this, here's the Super Bowl champion coach, Vince Lombardi, who took the Green Bay Packers to their championships. Vince loved his players. He drove them to no end in terms of the quest for perfection, but he loved them to the point, he said he would tell them in team meetings, he cared about them so much and he would actually start crying and get very emotional over his players. And here's a picture that's worth more than 1,000 words. One caring coach, what makes an NBA superstar? This is a picture of Kevin Durant announcing his signing back with the Golden State Warriors. And he specifically asked his high school coach to be there. And look at that hug, that says it all, because he felt this was the person who set him on the path to being an NBA superstar. And that just underscores the relational side of this in any context, whether it's sports, business, university, whatever, the relationships matter in a way that's going to directly impact productivity and achievement, and they go hand in hand. Now, just to underscore this further in terms of the university side, I just want to very briefly tell you about an initiative that was done at Carleton by my colleague, Tim Pitchell, who's an award-winning professor himself, won the 3M award. And I told him about mattering a couple of years ago, and he got this look on his face and he goes, this is the variable that I've been searching for, where I can feel it and I know sort of what it is, but now I know exactly what you're talking about. Well, in this study, what we've done, and it lists three thesis students who participated and led this project. It was an interview study of 12 award-winning professors at Carleton and 12 first-year students, 6 who were thriving and 6 who were struggling. And the focus was on looking for obvious and subtle ways to promote mattering and limit feelings of not mattering, with the expectation that professors who are award-winning have somehow figured it out that you need to make students come alive in the classroom through showing them that they matter, not just telling them that they matter. And we're still working through this, so it's very preliminary, but here's just a list of some of the things that came up in terms of what we call mattering micro practices. Students were saying, you know, it's important that the professor knows their name if somehow they can figure out their names in a large class, or the professor acknowledges the student in the hallway just with a nod or a hello, so that they feel seen and heard and when they're outside the classroom. or a professor who says they noticed when a student's been absent and just checked in and reached out and said, is everything okay? Showing concern for the student as a person. A democratic class is also something that's coming up, not playing favorites. Students said, you know, they're made to feel like they don't matter when their hand is up and they never get called on because the professor's always going to the same students. Getting a response to the emails, especially when it's a more personal email, is critical. And then generally checking in with the student as a person so that they're not just there as a student, but they're an individual person who has other things going on in their lives. And I know all about that during the time I spent as undergrad director and hearing some of the issues that students were dealing with. And I've learned very early on not to see students as all in the category of students, that recognize that there's very much individual attention needed because of the individual experiences that students are having. Now, another application of this beyond the university is that it's relevant to topics, societal issues like youth homelessness. And I talked to Steve Gates, who's at York, of course, and got the Order of Canada. And mattering items are being included in the National Youth Homelessness Survey, consistent with the approach that they're now taking on the prevention of mattering, and realizing that maybe if young people feel like they matter and it's shown to them earlier on, that might lessen the chances that they'll end up homeless. And if they do become homeless, certainly a system that is responsive and makes them feel like they matter is going to be one that helps them cope and get on track. So there's one domain where it's not been studied at all, and now it's going to be studied. There's a picture of Steve looking relaxed pre-pandemic. Also a former York graduate, alumni Martin Heisel, who I still work with, my former thesis student and dissertation student, is now a professor at Western, has teamed up with funding from the Movember Fund to look at retirement groups for men men are particularly at risk for suicidal ideation and depression, especially around retirement or physical illness. And just having a group situation where the mattering can be conveyed. Make a long story short there, when the first group of men went through and were technically finished with the sessions, which were I think 12 or 15 altogether, they were asking if they could still stay together and keep it going. And indeed, of course, that was accommodated. So mattering is in there, and we now have that as a key factor. And it's certainly a key factor in terms of some of the outcomes, including suicide prevention. The US slogan for suicide prevention is "You Matter," and that's wrapped around asking people to seek help if they need it. And just to illustrate how this can be put into action, I'm now consulting with a company who's putting together some suicide prevention program for the province of Nova Scotia. And I was able to get them to include a focus on mattering in the actual survey, and then hopefully in terms of the campaign that's rolled out in the province of Nova Scotia, where they have a particular problem in terms of increased rates of suicide among men and adolescent boys. Another great Canadian campaign is the We Matter campaign by the Redford brothers and sisters up in Northwest Territories to look at Indigenous role models and across Canada. And this is focused on using multimedia in various forms to promote that sense of we matter and we're important, and that people are in it together in terms of a shared feeling amongst them, and not only belonging, but mattering. So this is another illustration of how mattering is being put into action in a way that changes lives, quite frankly. Now, I'll talk a little bit about some specific activities and some tips, and then we can open it up to questions. I want to reiterate that mattering is reciprocal. You get what you give. So one of the things that's been suggested is that young people, but anybody, can benefit from by being a peer-to-peer mentor or seeking out opportunities for volunteering. One of my concerns, of course, about the pandemic is that the chance to volunteer has been sort of taken away among the many other things that have been taken away from people. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, we need that to get back. But the key thing here is that given that it's a two-way street, if you engage in mentoring someone or volunteering, they benefit, but the person who's providing that, the mentor or the volunteer, also benefits. And it's a way to boost your own sense of mattering. And indeed, anybody who's too focused on achievement needs to find a way to sort of get outside of themselves in terms of making a contribution to the well-being of others and in the community. And ideally, there's opportunities in a community for that to happen. So some basic ways to promote mattering. Sometimes I give talks for parents and teachers and say, you know, okay, so what are some ways to promote mattering? First of all, we know from research that just actually spending time with people, there's no substitute for that. One of the things I would say to any parent is, you know, you gotta find a way to spend quality time, and any time spent is quality time, according to the younger person who's wanting that. Learn to be a great listener, not be distracted, and really show through your body language that you are paying attention to someone. Let them have a voice, that you really want to encourage them. It's sometimes hard, people not wanting to talk, but there are ways to get even the most reluctant young person to talk about what's going on with them. If somebody's been away for a while and knows that they've been missed, or if you just haven't seen them for a bit, you can just say to them, you know, I've been thinking about you. That has a powerful impact on people. You know, somebody says, oh, you've been thinking about me? Especially when it's somebody who seems very busy and preoccupied with other things. Remember key dates, birthdays, things of interest, family details if it's somebody you have outside of your own family. Some other specific things you can do. Everybody relies on emails and other forms of communication, but there's also the lost art of note writing, sending somebody a personal note where they know that you cared enough about them to sit down and craft something that was personally meaningful. An unexpected surprise or consideration where you just do something for somebody just because has a great impact. Expressing appreciation for somebody is something that we should learn to do more often. And not just for what they do, but who they are in your life. And mattering also in terms of promotion includes holding people to account when they need to. So there's stories, for instance, of Vince Lombardi giving players a dressing down, making them feel like maybe they're not going to be on the team anymore. And then later going to them and saying, I did that because I believe in you. I know you're capable of more. So you try to do it in a non-harsh way, but tell people you do have some expectancies when you see that they're not being true to themselves. And most importantly, because they're so destructive, eliminate acts or tendencies of anti-mattering, micro practices, negative interactions where you can convey to somebody, you know what, maybe other things matter more to me than you do. So, you know, if there's an opportunity to acknowledge somebody who's you've missed, do it. Don't let it go by. Don't let your schedule get out of control so much that you lose touch in terms of giving other people some time in your life. If you have to be critical, you don't criticize the person in terms of fixed dispositional, but how they're going about things, because you still want to inspire them to not shut down and to reach their potential. Another thing that suggests not mattering is if you interrupt and are talking over someone all the time. And there's also something called phubbing. Sounds kind of sexy, but this is the term for when you're busy looking at your phone or your iPad and you're not paying attention to what the person is saying. And that has been studied in one paper, actually, showing its link with feelings of not mattering and not having a great connection with someone else. I just want to wrap up with two more things. In the book I referred to towards the end, I actually talked about the idea that maybe mattering needs to be defined and recognized as a human right. The UN Convention in 1999 on the Rights of the Child identified 54 stated rights, including the child's right to care and protection. And I think 55 should be the child's right to have a feeling of mattering to the people in his or his life and in the child's community. And said in there that we have an obligation to provide each child with this positive sense of self and the security that comes with knowing that he or she matters to the people in his or her life. What a rocky start you get when you don't have that feeling, but you have all kinds of advantage when you do have that feeling, including the ability to withstand interpersonal issues and mistreatment. So if somebody's bullying you or criticizing you or ostracizing you, if you have in the back of your mind the knowledge that the people who you really have in your life, that you matter to them and they matter to you, you're going to be able to let some of that other stuff bounce off like you have a deflector shield on. But on the other hand, if you don't have that sense, you're more likely to take on that and maybe feel somehow that you deserve that treatment, which of course nobody deserves. But you won't have that same sense of resilience and adaptability. And I'll just finish with this slide here. You no doubt can't see it, but I'll tell you what that is. That's a stairway in one of the local school boards where students were given the stem. I feel like I matter at school when ... And then they had to come up with their own slogan or saying that for each of the stairs. So essentially what you're looking at is the mattering stairwell, where students, how could you not have a great start to your day if you're going up those stairs? You know, some of the ones are, I matter, I know I matter at school when I can trust someone really listens to me, and when I help someone out, to reflect that sense of reaching out to others. And that clearly is a theme that the school has embraced. And I also like to look at it that way, as mattering essentially will lift you up just like that stairwell will. And you can lift up the people around you by instilling that sense of mattering in them as well. Okay, thanks very much. I think I did leave a bit of time for questions.
Indeed so. Gord, thank you as always. Informative and insightful. I invite people to type your questions in the Q&A or in the chat room. And while you're doing that, I'll start with one. Around the notion of frontline workers in the era of the pandemic, there have been recognition efforts, certain communities kind of banging pots and pans and such. But some of the critiques around that has been around the how substantive it is, and that it's a somewhat hollow show of support. You talked about the two coins, the two sides of the coin. Any comments around the extent to which we really need to kind of back up our efforts? How would you respond to that kind of critique, that it was kind of like just a hollow response?
Right. Well, I look at, I can see how that could be a criticism, but I think some acknowledgement is better than no acknowledgement. And we have to recognize this, but also we have to see other things happen to really further that sense of being supported and mattering and being valued. And written a paper with a colleague about this in terms of the relevance of mattering to the pandemic, in terms of other things that need to happen. And of course, I'm specifically thinking about the frontline workers, but anyone who's at risk. And we have another paper about the treatment of the elderly as a result, especially in long-term care, as reflected this. So, the main thing about is that it's hollow support. I see it as a starting point. Then we have to do other things. We have to recognize the value of these people in a variety of ways, whether it's through pay, through written messages, reaching out to people in person when there's that opportunity, and sustain it as well, because there's going to be long-term outcomes experience. People are talking about the traumatic stress of the frontline workers, and they're going to be dealing with this for a long time. So we need to find ways to really show they value. And of course, this will include, when it's not a health risk to do so, really listening to people and getting their stories. And I think finding ways to bring them together, similar to the retirement group of men, so that they can see that their reactions are shared. That normalizes it a little, so they don't feel personally embarrassed or ashamed. But I think it was important that we at least do something when that first started. But it clearly, it's not enough. And I also was thinking about the communities where that wasn't happening, so that somebody who's a frontline worker there was feeling, well, maybe I'm not living in the right community. But it was such a challenging time, it's hard to judge anybody.
Thank you very much. I don't see anything in there, so I'm going to be self-indulgent. I have another question. You had referred within
Love talking to you, Michael.
Always. You referred to the statistics that there's anywhere from like 1/3 to 40% of students self-identifying that they feel they don't matter. you get institutions like schools that play a real influencing role in supporting kids. If we put you in charge, Gord, what are some of the things that you would do specifically to address this for youth?
Are you talking about youth? Okay. Well, in other work, I've talked about how there needs to be more of a focus in the daily or weekly experience of students on the psychosocial and mental health related themes. And this is something that, you know, an educator might say, well, this is going to take valuable time away from our curriculum. And I would argue that a focus on promoting mattering and limit the feeling of not mattering is going to pay off enormously in terms of student engagement, less absenteeism, less acting out. So I would go a step further, not just focusing on mattering promotion, although that would be a key part of it. And indeed, in a partnership I have with the Durham District School Board, mattering is built in as a key focus of their mental health strategy. So, and there's other school boards that have embraced this as well. The York Region School Board, the Niagara District School Board, because of the concerns they have about the mental health. I didn't show it, but just to illustrate this, we also ask questions about mattering at school. And again, we find that maybe 2/5 of the students, or at least a third, say they don't feel like they matter at school. So why don't they feel like they matter at school? There are some subtle things that can be done, and schools have done this, like the teacher lining up and greeting the children by name when they come in, or just checking in with them proactively is another thing to do as well. But I think it needs to be part of a much broader emphasis on promotion and prevention, because of course my other topic I study is perfectionism. A little bit of awareness on perfectionism could lead to changing it to a more healthy form of excellence rather than striving for absolute perfection. And in that regard, one of the reasons we have found that connects these two topic areas, that some people strive for perfection because they feel like they don't matter. Maybe they're not getting the attention, the love, the respect that they deserve. So they feel, well, if I'm perfect, then I am going to matter. I'm going to have that, I'm going to get on that radar. And sadly, we know when talking with my colleague with some of his clinical patients is that there are people with amazing accomplishments, but they come from an interpersonal background where they're not going to get that love and affection. And then they're setting themselves up for other problems. But they may not have ever even tried to or need to feel perfect and strive for that if they already had that sense of mattering and mattering unconditionally because of who they are.
All right, I'll turn my camera off. I believe we have a couple questions that have come in. First one from Joe, our colleague, Joe Baker. Thanks, Gord. Are you aware of any youth sport programs explicitly focusing on mattering? Seems like many of the issues this domain struggles with, such as specialization and pressure, could be related to mattering.
Yes, there's sadly, I've only come up with a few instances of it. And, you know, I'm sure that there'll be a much stronger payoff anytime that it is a factor. When you think about it, being a good teammate is to feel like you're part of the team and everybody's part of the team. So there's many applications when it comes to sports and athletics. I see in the literature where it's sort of talked around in terms of similar concepts like support and belongingness, but there's still that something added extra that focus on being valued has. And you know, in the case of Vince Lombardi, I was giving that example. There's one instance in the book by a famous Hall of Fame player, Jerry Kramer, where he had made a mistake in a game and Lombardi showed his mistake to the whole team on the Monday film session over 30 times, humiliating the player. And Kramer said after they're done and he's sitting there in the locker room thinking his career is over, Lombardi comes up and puts his arm around him and gives him the, I know you have it in you, and this is why I did that. I'm not just trying to be a mean SOB. And that sort of thing inspired Kramer to go on to be an NFL Hall of Fame player. But it can be injected right into programs because I think that's also a great vehicle for spreading the word about mattering and the feeling and making things not get to a point of hyper competitiveness in some circumstances where it becomes too much pressure and too damaging.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll move on to another question, but first a comment from Adrian, which I am confident reflects all of our sentiments. Thank you so much, Gord. Your work matters. But the question from Nisha, what does your research show about kids who are disadvantaged in terms of parental mattering? What recommendations do you have for kids who had had a rocky start and did not really grow up in a home where they mattered?
Yeah, that's important. This is why other sources need to be put into play, and it's sad. I've talked to school officials about this in terms of promoting mattering at school, and then the child might be returning to an environment where that's not the case, and the discrepancy has become very salient for them now. So that's where it's important that other settings need to try and instill that sense of mattering, that the school setting, the community, and so on, because you need to be able to get it somewhere. And also send to that person, maybe now as a young adult, the notion that they can find ways to navigate mattering in their own lives so that they can develop it without waiting for it to happen as well. The agentic component is something that I really like about this variable, that you don't just have to wait for it to happen. But for those who have had severe issues with it, of course, they might need therapy or counseling, but there too, having a therapist or a counselor who is attuned to the need to matter and to convey that you're in a safe space with somebody who truly cares about you is the type of therapy process setting that you want to have. And there's many research applications in that setting as well.
Thank you very much, Gord. I think we have time for one more. Question came in from Finote. Are you aware of any research on belonging in adult homelessness?
There is research on 2 papers on mattering, not belonging, but mattering, and homelessness in adults by a guy named Bruce DeForge. And this is where I started my conversations at York with Steve, because it clearly shows that even though they've negotiated the homelessness, that the scores on mattering were still pretty high. And the more elevated the mattering score was in these homeless adults, the better their adaptation was in terms of less depression, less anxiety, and so on. So there's only like 2 studies, and then there's a descriptive account that's in the literature. I'm writing a commentary right now and hoping to join with Steve to point these things out more systematically. But the focus on prevention is one of the reasons why it's now included in the National Youth Homelessness Survey. And indeed, the services need to be responsive to the homeless individual so that they will also feel that they're mattering in terms of the people who should be showing that they care about them, because they do care about them.
Thank you very much for the question. It's almost the top of the hour. My most important job is making sure that we end on time. Gord, on behalf of Krista and myself, on behalf of all the participants, we're very grateful for your time. We wish you continued success with your research and looking forward to keeping in touch, especially supporting that mobilizing mattering. That's catchy. That could go somewhere. But yeah, thank you so much.
We should write something on that, Michael.
That sounds fabulous. For the folks in Southern Ontario who are enjoying sunshine and warmth, get out, enjoy it. Take good care of yourselves and each other. Gord, thanks again, and look forward to keeping in touch, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.